Imagine this. You are Catherine Marsh, a lady-in-waiting to Lady Jane Grey, and it is October 1554. Your hands tremble as you stand before the ecclesiastical court in Norwich, the stone walls pressing in around you. The bishop's cold eyes bore into you as he asks the question again, slower this time, enunciating each word like a blade. Tell us what you witnessed in Lady Jane's bedchamber on the night of April 12th. Every intimate detail, every whispered word, every private moment between husband and wife. The scribe's quill scratches across parchment, recording your humiliation for eternity. You can feel the weight of the other women in the gallery, their faces pale with the knowledge that they might be next. What you don't yet understand is that Queen Mary has transformed the most private spaces of marriage into hunting grounds for heresy, and your testimony will send 3 women to the stake, not for what they believed, but for what they did in the darkness of their own bedrooms. This is not the story of Bloody Mary you learned in school. This is the tale of how England's first queen regnant wielded intimate violation as a weapon of religious warfare, turning women's bodies into battlefields and marital beds into confession chambers. What Mary ordered done to Protestant women in the name of God and crown makes the public burnings seem almost merciful by comparison. The horrors she commanded happened behind closed doors, in examination rooms, in bedchambers where witnesses were forced to watch and report. These are the punishments that history tried to bury. The violations, too shameful to record in official chronicles, the systematic torture of women through the weaponization of their own intimate lives. The ecclesiastical courts of Mary's reign were not merely tribunals of faith. They became inquisitorial chambers where the most private acts between married couples were dragged into public scrutiny and judged as evidence of heresy. In the court records of Norwich, preserved in faded ink that has survived nearly 5 centuries, you can still read the testimony extracted from women like Catherine Marsh. The questions are explicit, designed to humiliate as much as to investigate. Did your mistress show pleasure in her husband's embraces? Did she resist her marital duties? Did she use any herbs or methods to prevent conception? Did she speak against the holy sacrament of marriage during intimate moments? These were not idle inquiries. Mary's commissioners believed that Protestant women, influenced by Reformed theology that suggested marriage was a partnership rather than female submission, were committing heresy through their very bodies. A woman who enjoyed marital relations too enthusiastically was demonstrating the lustful nature that reformers encouraged. A woman who showed reluctance was failing in her Catholic duty of wifely obedience. Either response could be twisted into evidence of religious deviance. The trap was perfect, and hundreds of women found themselves ensnared. Jane Wilkinson discovered this in 1555 when her own servants, coerced by Mary's agents, testified about her private conversations with her husband. The court record states that she had expressed relief at not conceiving after 2 years of marriage, suggesting she found ways to prevent pregnancy. This admission, combined with testimony that she had questioned certain Catholic practices regarding marital duties, was enough. Jane was forced to stand before the Norwich Ecclesiastical Court and confess in graphic detail every aspect of her intimate life. The humiliation was deliberate, calculated to break her spirit before any physical punishment began. But here's what makes this truly twisted. The confessions themselves became a form of torture. Women were required to describe their most private moments in explicit language, using terms that violated their modesty and sense of dignity. If they refused, they faced imprisonment. If they complied, their words were recorded and circulated among other courts as examples of Protestant depravity. The Spanish ambassador, Simon Renard, wrote to King Philip II describing these proceedings with barely concealed satisfaction, noting that the examination of heretical women's intimate practices was proving effective in terrifying Protestant communities into submission. The bedroom had become a surveillance state. Servants were encouraged to spy and report. Midwives were conscripted as informants, required to note any signs that women might be using preventive methods. Even the marriage bed itself was no longer private. In some cases, witnesses were actually required to be present on wedding nights to ensure proper Catholic submission occurred. The violation was total, systematic, and sanctioned by the highest authority in the land. What you've just witnessed is merely the surface of Mary's intimate terror. The interrogations and forced confessions were designed to identify women for the next phase of her campaign, a phase that would transform suspicion into physical examination and private shame into public degradation. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Mary's own body became the catalyst for the nightmare that followed. In 1554, Mary announced she was pregnant. The entire kingdom waited for her heir who would secure Catholic succession. Physicians examined her. Her abdomen swelled. She withdrew from public life in preparation for confinement. But no child came. By August 1555, the truth became undeniable. Mary had experienced a phantom pregnancy, her desperate desire for an heir manifesting as physical symptoms without actual conception. The humiliation was profound, and it poisoned her mind with a toxic combination of shame and paranoia. Mary became obsessed with fertility and conception. If her own womb had failed her, she would ensure that Protestant women could not succeed where she had not. The logic was twisted but brutally simple. Protestant theology encouraged women to view marriage differently, as a partnership that might include planning family size or spacing children. To Mary, this was heresy of the deepest kind, an attempt to thwart God's divine plan for procreation. Women who prevented pregnancy were not just violating Catholic doctrine, they were personally mocking her failure. The pregnancy inquisitions began in earnest in 1556. Protestant women, particularly those married to known reformers, were summoned before royal physicians and church-appointed midwives for intimate examinations. Elizabeth Barton, a merchant's wife in London, was dragged from her home in March 1556 and subjected to an examination so invasive and humiliating that the records, even written in clinical Latin, are difficult to read. The physicians were searching for evidence of prevention methods, signs that she had used herbs or barriers or any technique to avoid conception. Elizabeth's case file, preserved in the ecclesiastical archives, documents what happened when the examination revealed she had not been pregnant in 3 years of marriage, despite her youth and apparent health. She was accused of willful prevention, of using secret methods passed down through Protestant networks. Under interrogation, she admitted that an older woman had taught her about certain herbs and timing methods. This confession sealed her fate, and that of the woman who had helped her. The systematic nature of these examinations is documented in letters between church officials. In one particularly chilling correspondence, Bishop Edmund Bonner describes establishing a network of trusted midwives who would report on Protestant women's reproductive patterns. These informants were paid from church funds and given authority to demand examinations of any woman suspected of prevention. The surveillance extended into the most intimate aspects of women's lives, tracking menstrual cycles, noting the frequency of marital relations through servant testimony, and documenting any signs of deliberate childlessness. Mary's paranoia intensified with her second phantom pregnancy in late 1555. This time, when no child materialized, her rage found new targets. Women who had successfully borne children were now suspect if they stopped conceiving. The logic was insane but rigidly enforced. A woman with 3 or 4 children who then failed to conceive for a year or more must be using prevention methods, and prevention was heresy. Dozens of women found themselves before examining boards, their bodies probed and their privacy shattered, all because they had stopped having children at a pace that satisfied the Queen's tortured expectations. Now that you've witnessed how Mary transformed women's bodies into evidence of heresy, you're beginning to understand the systematic nature of her intimate terrors. If uncovering these buried truths about how power wielded the most private violations resonates with your hunger for real history, subscribing ensures you never miss these deep dives into the darkest corners of human authority. Because what comes next, the punishments for women who dared claim autonomy over their own bodies, will shatter everything you thought you knew about Tudor England and reveal horrors that official histories deliberately obscured. The examinations were only the beginning. Women who were found to have prevented pregnancy, or who were even suspected of doing so, faced punishments specifically designed to weaponize their intimate shame. The ecclesiastical courts developed a doctrine that would justify the nightmare to come. They called it the heresy of pleasure, and it would claim dozens of lives before Mary's reign finally ended. The theological reasoning was as twisted as it was comprehensive. Catholic doctrine taught that marital relations existed solely for procreation. Any pleasure derived from the act was at best a necessary evil, at worst a sinful indulgence that required confession and penance. But Protestant reformers, particularly those influenced by Martin Luther's more positive view of marital intimacy, had begun teaching that pleasure within marriage was acceptable, even blessed by God, as part of the partnership between husband and wife. To Mary's bishops, this represented a fundamental corruption that needed to be rooted out through the bodies of Protestant women themselves. Anne Askew's interrogation transcripts from 1556 reveal how this doctrine was applied. Anne, already under suspicion for her reformist views, was questioned extensively about her marriage. The interrogators wanted to know if she had experienced satisfaction in her marital duties. The question was a trap. If she admitted pleasure, she was demonstrating the lustful nature that Protestantism encouraged. If she denied it, she was admitting to failing in her wifely duty. Anne, known for her sharp intelligence, refused to answer, stating that such matters were between herself, her husband, and God. Her silence was taken as confirmation of guilt. The punishments escalated in horrific fashion. Women accused of taking excessive pleasure in marital relations were subjected to public shaming rituals designed specifically to attack their intimate dignity. Margaret Pole of Canterbury found herself in 1557 facing charges that her servants had reported sounds of enjoyment from her bedchamber. The accusation seems absurd to modern sensibilities, but in Mary's England it was deadly serious. Margaret was forced to stand in the public square wearing a sign that detailed her supposed sin, describing her as a woman of lustful nature who had abandoned proper Catholic submission for Protestant depravity. But the public shaming was merely the prelude. Women like Margaret then faced physical examinations designed to find evidence of their corruption. Church-appointed physicians conducted invasive procedures looking for signs of excessive use, anything that could be presented as proof of unnatural pleasure-seeking. The medical understanding of the time was hopelessly confused, but that didn't stop the examiners from producing detailed reports describing supposed physical evidence of sinful behavior. These reports were read aloud in court, adding another layer of humiliation to women who were already broken by the process. The torture took forms both physical and psychological. Some women were imprisoned in conditions specifically designed to torment them with reminders of their supposed intimate sins. Cells were decorated with crude drawings, mocking marital relations. Guards were instructed to make lewd comments and gestures. The goal was to break the women completely, to make them internalize shame about their own bodies and their own experiences of marriage. Many women confessed to anything their interrogators wanted, desperately seeking an end to the psychological torment, even knowing that confession might lead to death. The case of Agnes Press illustrates the full horror of Mary's intimate Inquisition. Agnes, a widow from Cornwall, was arrested in 1557 on suspicion of Protestant sympathies. During her interrogation, church officials became fixated on her previous marriage. Witnesses testified that Agnes had been a passionate wife who clearly enjoyed her husband's company. This became the centerpiece of her trial. She was accused of embodying the lustful nature that Protestantism encouraged, of having abandoned proper Catholic restraint for sensual indulgence. The charges were insane, but the court treated them with deadly seriousness. Agnes was subjected to examinations, interrogations, and public shamings over the course of months. The psychological torture was designed to make her renounce her faith by breaking her through intimate humiliation. When she refused to recant, when she maintained that her marriage had been blessed and holy, and that love between husband and wife was no sin, the court declared her a heretic, not for her theological beliefs, but for her defense of marital pleasure. She was burned at Southern Hay in Exeter, her death warrant specifically citing her heretical views on the intimate duties of marriage. The intersection of religious persecution and intimate violation reached its peak in Mary's final years. The Queen's fury at her own childlessness had metastasized into a systematic campaign against Protestant women's bodies themselves. But the worst was still to come, a horror so extreme that it would haunt England long after Mary's death finally ended the nightmare. What Mary ordered next crossed a line that even her most loyal supporters found difficult to stomach. Forced marriages became a weapon of religious conformity, with Protestant women compelled to wed Catholic loyalists as punishment for their family's faith. The policy was designed with calculated cruelty. By forcing Protestant women into marriages with Catholic men, Mary believed she could break the will of Protestant communities and ensure that the next generation would be raised Catholic. But the reality was far more brutal than mere strategic calculation. The Seymour sisters, Elizabeth and Catherine, discovered this horror in 1557. Their father had been a known Protestant sympathizer who fled England when Mary took the throne. The sisters, left behind, found themselves targeted specifically because of their family name and their faith. They were arrested on fabricated charges, and brought before church courts where they faced a choice that was no choice at all: marry the Catholic men chosen for them or face imprisonment and possible execution for heresy. Their resistance would be futile, their consent meaningless. The marriages would happen regardless. Elizabeth Seymour was 17 years old when she was forced to marry Sir Richard Warwick, a Catholic loyalist twice her age, who had specifically requested a Protestant bride as reward for his service to the Queen. The wedding was conducted with all the ceremony of a normal marriage, complete with a priest and witnesses and vows spoken in a church. But everyone present understood the truth. This was not a marriage. It was a sanctioned assault, a violation dressed in religious garments and legal authority. What makes this even more disturbing is that the forced marriages came with specific requirements designed to ensure complete submission. Wedding night witnesses were mandatory, not just present in the building, but actually positioned to verify that proper consummation occurred and that the bride submitted appropriately. These witnesses were instructed to listen for sounds of resistance, to watch for signs that the woman was not fulfilling her new wifely duties. If the bride resisted too strongly, if she fought or screamed or attempted to prevent the marriage's consummation, the witnesses were to intervene and assist the husband in overcoming her resistance. The legal framework for this horror was meticulously constructed. Church law held that once married, a wife owed her husband absolute obedience in all things, including intimate matters. Resistance to marital duties was itself a sin that could be punished by the ecclesiastical courts. By forcing Protestant women into these marriages, Mary created a situation where their own bodies became instruments of their religious persecution. They could not resist without committing sin. They could not flee without abandoning their legal obligations. They were trapped in marriages designed to break them. Catherine Seymour tried to resist. On her wedding night, she fought so violently that the witnesses had to physically restrain her while her new husband, Thomas Grenville, completed the consummation. The brutality was documented in witness statements submitted to the ecclesiastical court, described in clinical language that barely masked the horror. Catherine's resistance was noted as evidence of her Protestant pride and willful disobedience. She was publicly flogged the next day as punishment for resisting her marital duties, the whipping administered in the town square as a warning to other Protestant women who might think to resist the marriages being imposed upon them. The psychological torture of these forced marriages was as deliberate as the physical violations. Protestant women were compelled to bear children to Catholic men, to raise those children in the faith they themselves had rejected. Their own bodies became the instruments of their community's destruction. Some women, faced with this impossible situation, chose death instead. Records from 1557 and 1558 document several cases of Protestant women who took their own lives rather than submit to forced marriages, their desperation driving them to what the Church considered the ultimate sin. John Fox documented these cases years later in his Book of Martyrs, interviewing survivors who remembered the terror of those years. The women who lived through forced marriages described a psychological torment that never ended. They were required to submit to husbands they despised, to participate in Catholic rituals in their own homes, to raise children who would be taught that their mother's faith was heresy. Many reported that the intimate violations they endured were worse than any physical torture, that the destruction of their bodily autonomy was more complete than anything rack or flame could achieve. But Mary was not finished. The ultimate horror was still to come. The intersection of faith and fertility that would lead to the most shocking executions of her entire reign. The final escalation of Mary's intimate terror came in early 1558, when the Queen issued a decree that would formalize the insanity that had been building throughout her reign. Protestant women who deliberately prevented pregnancy were to be charged not merely with heresy of belief, but with treason against God and crown. The reasoning was twisted but brutally logical within Mary's paranoid worldview. By preventing conception, these women were refusing to produce Catholic children, thereby weakening the realm's defenses against Protestant heresy. Their wombs had become treasonous, their fertility a matter of national security. The Colchester cases brought this doctrine to its horrific conclusion. In March 1558, 3 women were arrested in the town of Colchester on charges that would have been unthinkable just years before. Agnes Press, Joan Trunchfield, and Elizabeth Ffoulkes were accused of conspiring to prevent pregnancy through the use of herbs and timing methods. The evidence against them came from a midwife who had been conscripted into Mary's network of informants. She testified that all 3 women had consulted her about methods to space their children, to recover their strength between births, to avoid the constant pregnancies that killed so many women of their generation. The parish records of Colchester still preserve the details of their trial. The women did not deny seeking such information. They argued, with desperate logic, that preserving their own health so they could better care for existing children was no crime, that God would not condemn them for seeking to survive. But the court was unmerciful. Under Mary's new decree, their actions constituted heresy of the womb, a rejection of Catholic teaching about women's sacred duty to bear as many children as God provided, regardless of the cost to their own bodies or lives. Agnes Press was a mother of 4 who had nearly died in her last childbirth. The midwife testified that Agnes had explicitly asked for methods to prevent future pregnancies, saying she feared another birth would kill her and leave her children motherless. The court showed no sympathy. Agnes's desire to survive was reframed as selfish rebellion against divine will. Her body was not her own. It belonged to God and the Catholic Church, and her attempt to control it was treason. Joan Trunchfield's case was even more brutal. Joan had conceived and miscarried 3 times in rapid succession. Her body weakened to the point where her physician warned that another pregnancy might be fatal. She had sought the midwife's advice on how to give her body time to recover. This prudent medical decision was presented to the court as willful rebellion against the sacrament of marriage and the divine command to be fruitful and multiply. Joan's own words, preserved in the trial transcript, are heartbreaking in their simple dignity. I wished only to live long enough to raise the children God had already given me. For this crime of hoping to survive, she was condemned. Elizabeth Ffoulkes represented the ultimate target of Mary's persecution. Elizabeth was young, newly married, and had come to the midwife before conceiving any children at all. She wanted to know how to delay pregnancy for a year or 2, to establish her household and strengthen her health before beginning childbearing. This preventive consultation, this attempt to plan her own family's future, was treated as the most severe form of heresy. The court declared that even 1 month of deliberate prevention was a rejection of God's plan and a treasonous act against the realm's need for Catholic children. The three women were convicted in April 1558 and sentenced to death by burning. The executions were scheduled for early May, conducted with a ceremony designed to emphasize the specific nature of their crime. Unlike other heretics who were burned for their beliefs, these women were explicitly condemned for their attempts to control their own fertility. The death warrants stated clearly that they were being executed for heresy of the womb, for treasoning against their own bodies and the sacred duty of Catholic motherhood. Agnes Potton, Joan Trunchfield, and Elizabeth Folkes were tied to stakes in Colchester's Market Square on May 4, 1558. The crowd that gathered was reported to be unusually quiet, many spectators disturbed by the specific charges against the women. These were not firebrands who had preached reformation from pulpits. They were ordinary wives and mothers, whose only crime was seeking to survive and to have some small measure of control over their own bodies. As the flames rose, witnesses reported that Agnes called out to the crowd, telling them to remember that women were dying not for their faith alone, but for daring to claim ownership of their own flesh. The executions sent shockwaves through England. Even some of Mary's Catholic supporters began to question whether the persecution had gone too far. Burning women for preventing pregnancy crossed a line that many found unconscionable, but Mary, by this point gravely ill with what was likely ovarian cancer, showed no sign of mercy or doubt. In her final months, she continued to sign death warrants for women accused of intimate heresies, her body's failure driving her to ever more extreme attempts to control the bodies of her female subjects. Mary died on November 17, 1558, her death bringing an immediate end to the intimate persecutions that had defined her reign. Elizabeth I, taking the throne, moved quickly to dismantle the machinery of sexual inquisition her sister had built. The ecclesiastical courts were reformed, the networks of informant midwives were disbanded, and the doctrine of intimate heresy was quietly abandoned. But the trauma lingered for generations. Women who had survived Mary's reign carried psychological scars that never fully healed. Communities that had watched neighbors dragged before examining boards and burned for bodily autonomy remained haunted by the memory. The death toll from Mary's intimate persecutions is difficult to calculate precisely. Official records document at least 60 women executed specifically for charges related to sexual or reproductive heresy. Dozens more died in prison awaiting trial or from injuries sustained during examinations and torture. Hundreds were subjected to forced marriages, examinations, and public shamings that destroyed their lives even if they escaped execution. The true number of victims will never be known, as many cases were deliberately obscured or destroyed after Elizabeth took the throne. What makes Mary's intimate terror particularly chilling is how it reveals the intersection of religious authority, state power, and control over women's bodies. The same dynamics that allowed ecclesiastical courts to examine women's private lives and punish them for bodily autonomy would reappear throughout history in different forms. The impulse to control women's reproduction, to make their intimate lives subject to public scrutiny and punishment, to treat their bodies as property of church or state rather than their own, these patterns persist across centuries and cultures. You came into this story thinking, Mary, I was merely Bloody Mary for burning Protestants. Now you leave understanding that her cruelty penetrated deeper than public executions, into the most intimate spaces of women's lives, transforming bedrooms into interrogation chambers and wombs into evidence of treason. This transformation of perspective is exactly why these hidden histories matter. If this journey into the specific horrors visited upon women's bodies has awakened your appetite for truth beyond the textbook version, subscribing means you'll continue accessing these revelations that sanitized history won't teach. The stories of Agnes, Joan, Elizabeth, and hundreds of unnamed women deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to religious conflict, but as testimonies to the price women paid when their bodies became battlegrounds in struggles for power and faith. The legacy of Mary's reign extends beyond the immediate victims. Her systematic persecution of women through intimate violation established precedents that would echo through English history. The idea that women's bodies were subject to state examination and control, that reproduction was a matter of public concern rather than private choice, that pleasure and prevention were crimes deserving punishment. These concepts did not die with Mary. They transformed and adapted, appearing in new forms as generations passed, always justified by whatever authority claimed the right to regulate women's intimate lives. Standing in the archives today, reading the faded testimony of women like Catherine Marsh, you can still feel the horror of what Mary unleashed. The careful script of court recorders documented violations with bureaucratic precision, preserving for history the systematic nature of the terror. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were calculated policies, implemented through established legal channels, justified by theological doctrine, and carried out with the full authority of church and crown. The machinery of intimate persecution was built with such thoroughness that it took years to fully dismantle after Mary's death. The women who died in Colchester were among the last victims of Mary's reign, but their deaths resonated through the decades that followed. Elizabeth Thine, herself nearly a victim of her sister's paranoia, understood intimately the price women paid under regimes that sought to control their bodies. While Elizabeth never married and never faced the intimate violations Mary inflicted on others, her own experience of being examined, questioned, and suspected of sexual impropriety during her sister's reign shaped her understanding of power and its abuses. The Virgin Queen's refusal to marry was not just political calculation, it was a declaration that her body belonged to herself alone. The nightmare that Mary created finally ended with her death, but the women who lived through it carried the memories forever. They whispered their stories to daughters and granddaughters, warnings about what happened when religious zealotry combined with state power to target women's most private selves. These whispered histories, dismissed or ignored by official chronicles, preserved the truth that textbooks would later try to sanitize. Mary was not just bloody for the fires she lit. She was monstrous for the intimate horrors she sanctioned, the violations she ordered, the bodily autonomy she destroyed in the name of religious purity and dynastic desperation. The story of Mary's sexual punishments is not comfortable history. It forces us to confront the reality that women's bodies have always been contested territory, battlegrounds where struggles for power, faith, and control play out with brutal consequences. The specific horrors of Mary's reign, the forced marriages in examination chambers and burnings for bodily autonomy, may seem distant from our modern world. But the underlying dynamics, the impulse to regulate women's intimate lives, to make reproduction a matter of public control, to punish women for claiming ownership of their own flesh, These patterns remain disturbingly familiar across time and culture. 3 women burned in Colchester for seeking to control their own fertility. Dozens more destroyed by forced marriages and public shamings. Hundreds traumatized by examinations and interrogations that violated their most private selves. This was Mary's legacy, written not in the grand narratives of religious conflict, but in the broken bodies and shattered lives of women whose only crime was being Protestant in a realm ruled by a queen whose own body had betrayed her, and who made all women pay the price for her failure.